What if you were to take the Power 5 conferences and add or replace a few teams in a regular Power 5 college football conference? What if? Well, this is what I want to talk about. I want to propose some interesting things. I want to talk about the best non-Power 5 teams in college football and talk about the key games they have this year if they want to be in a New Year's Six bowl game. Let's get right to it. The first team that I would like to talk about is Notre Dame. But overall, these are the teams that I believe have the ability to possibly make a New Year's bowl game this year. Okay, you got Notre Dame, Fresno State, UCF, Army, Cincinnati, Utah State, Boise State, App State, and UAB. UAB, yes, absolutely. It's not a crazy thought. All right, so Notre Dame. This is pretty clear. The first couple of games that they have are pretty important. And Georgia's one of those games. Then they play Michigan and Stanford. And I think that if Notre Dame wants to be anybody, these are the three games they have to win. Because if they lose one of these three games, they're out of a New Year's Six game. That's what I think. Now, the good enough. What does that mean? I think that Notre Dame is good enough to play in a Power 5 conference, and most of all of us could agree with that. But the question is where. If they join the ACC, which some of their other sports programs are in, then I think they do pretty good, and they would definitely give Clemson, Florida State, they would give the big dogs in that conference a run for their money. So it would be kind of neat, but the independent thing is pretty cool. So I'm not against it. But Notre Dame, they're one of those that you just can't. They're probably never going to be anything other than independent in football. There's nothing that would entice that to happen. All right, UCF. Well, UCF is in a non-Power 5 conference, but the conference that they're in is getting better. This year, in 2019, they play Stanford, Pitt, and Cincinnati. These are key games. Actually, they're key games for Stanford and they're key games for Cincinnati also. They've got to win these three games. And if they do win all three of these games and they win their division, they'll likely be in a New Year's Six bowl again. Are they good enough to be in the SEC or the ACC, though? Yes, they are good enough to be in the ACC or the SEC because they're better than the middle-of-the-road teams. They beat Auburn a couple of years ago, so they've proven themselves. All right, let's talk about Army. Army is probably going to start the season ranked top 25. It's going to be really close. But they play Michigan, Air Force, and Navy this year. Those are really only their key games. And Air Force and Navy ought to be wins. Michigan, man, that's going to be... I'm going to watch that game. Not in person, but I'm definitely going to watch it on TV. And do I think that they are good enough to be in a conference other than be independent? They're not independent, but are they good enough to be in the Big Ten or the ACC? I don't think so. I don't think that Army would do well in the Big Ten, and I also don't think that Army would do well in the ACC because their recruiting is completely different. I think Army needs to stay independent. This is my opinion. And Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati has had recent success. They've also had past success. So, especially in the last 10 years, they've had some good NFL drafts. I want to say their key games this year are UCLA, Ohio State, and UCF. And the reason why I say UCLA, because UCLA's they're just not good. And the reason being is that that's one of the games on a schedule where they really need to do well because they're going to start high in the rankings in the early season. They've got to slaughter UCLA. They have to make a statement against UCLA. And then obviously the game against Ohio State needs to be... I mean, even if they lose, if they play Ohio State really well, that would be good for them to try to make it into a New Year's Six bowl game if they win out. But they also play UCF. So I think that Cincinnati is one of the tougher non-Power 5 team schedules given their current situation. And I do think that Cincinnati is good enough to be in the Big Ten. They're right there, right in the heart. They could replace Maryland, send Maryland back to, I don't know, another non-Power 5 conference. Maryland is a Big Ten team, but I just don't know what to say about Maryland football. Okay, Boise State. Their key games this year: Florida State, BYU, and Utah State. And it doesn't really look impressive for Boise State as they continue to do well. Just to get into a New Year's Six bowl game, they're pretty much going to have to go undefeated, and it's not going to get them in the top 4 because they only play Florida State, Utah State, and BYU. Other than that, I don't play anybody worth a snot, so their chances of getting in are pretty good. Are they good enough to be in the Pac-12? Yes. Clearly, Boise State could be in the Pac-12 and do well in the Pac-12. I would like to see that. Where they're at now is good for their program because they're pretty much dominant. Utah State, again, is Utah State good enough now to be in the Pac-12? Well, this year, if they beat these 4 teams, then yes. Boise State, even if Boise State were to lose one of their key games, I still think they're good enough to be in the Pac-12. But as long as Utah State gets through Wake Forest and then plays well against LSU, obviously a win over LSU would be amazing. They play Boise State and BYU also, so yeah, they're good enough. Except they're just not a traditional program. So if they beat LSU, yeah, but I'm just going to say no. Utah State does not have the coaching that it takes to get into the Pac-12 and be dominant. And I'm going to say a big no to Utah State. I do not need them to leave the Pac-12. I don't want them to be part of another conference because until Boise State, or until they can overcome Boise State, they're going to stay. They need to stay right where they're at. Fresno State. Now, Fresno State is a team that has some power, man. They play USC, Minnesota, Air Force, and Utah State, and I really hope that they. I don't know. I'm really torn this year in college football because there's some teams that have a really good chance this year to make a name for their program outside of the Power 5 conferences, and definitely Fresno State is one of them. So I would think if they win 3 out of 4 of these games, they have a really good chance. As long as their only loss is to USC. But then again, USC is a slouch team this year. So I think Fresno State can win all 4 of these, and if they do, I think they should play in a New Year's Six bowl as long as they go, 2 or 1 loss or whatever, maybe even undefeated, and they are definitely good enough to be in the Pac-12. All right, App State. Well, App State has been impressive for a very long time, even when they were in an FCS school, and their transfer now to play in the postseason and do well has been great. And North Carolina is a big game this year for them because North Carolina's new coach Mac Brown. If App State gets a win over North Carolina State, which they probably will, and they beat South Carolina and Troy, and they have an 11-1 record, they need to play in a New Year's Six bowl game too. I mean, but they're battling up against UCF, and I understand. So it's going to be pretty tight to see which one of these teams gets in a New Year's Six game, and I think that they are good enough to play in the ACC. I don't think they're good enough to play in the SEC, but definitely they would do well in the ACC. And lastly, the ringer, right? I'm calling UAB to be the dark horse this year and the non-Power 5 to make the news, to make headlines. They play Tennessee. So, believe it or not, this may end up being a good game because Tennessee is a program on a downward trend. It's very unfortunate. Now, last year they won I'm guessing 4 games off the top of my head. The year before, I think they won 2, something like that. And they're in the SEC. So UAB could get a win over an SEC opponent, and I don't care who it is. And then, believe it or not, they play North Texas. And North Texas did okay last year for who they are, and UAB needs to get over them too. So that's all I have. UAB, the dark horse this year to make a name for themselves. I really hope that's the case, and do let me know your thoughts. I'm curious to see if there's another non-Power 5 team that you think is worthy of note this year. When you're watching football, are you going to tune into any of those key games? I'd like to know who. All right, later.